You're listening to the Inside Syracuse Basketball podcast presented by Crouse Health, the exclusive healthcare partner of Syracuse Athletics.
Well, welcome back to a special edition of the Inside Syracuse Basketball podcast. As we begin a series of podcasts leading up to February 24th when Syracuse plays Notre Dame at the JMA Wireless Dome. And on that day, Syracuse University is going to recognize the career of Jim Boeheim. Generally his coaching career, but also a playing career at Syracuse University. And to start us off here with some remembrances of Jim Boeheim, I brought in one of his former teammates at Syracuse University, a member of the same recruiting class back in 1962, Rex Trobridge. Rex, it's a privilege and honor to have you here on the podcast. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, just before we got going, we were sort of saying, we were talking about this day when Syracuse is going to recognize Jim Boeheim. And you were just saying, how well-deserved this honor is for Jim.
It's really quite remarkable. I can't think off the top of my head of any coach who has coached for 47 years, much less at the same school where they began. And his overall time was over 60 years from when he walked on in September of 1962 and then never left following working as a graduate assistant while he was playing basketball for Scranton Wilkes-Barre in the Eastern League and went to grad school, got his master's degree, was an assistant coach, and went on to become the head coach when Roy Danforth left for greener pastures. And so it's really quite a remarkable record.
So let's go back to 1962. Jim's in part of this recruiting class as a walk-on. The class also includes the legendary Dave Bing, yourself, your high school teammate Dick Abelman, Sam Penseal out of New York City, Frank Nicoletti out of New Jersey. I mean, it's really an amazing recruiting class. And I was wondering, since Jim's a walk-on and you guys are all scholarship players, what are your first memories of Jim? What were your first impressions of him?
Well, interestingly enough, my first memory of Jim, which I think is accurate, but in the space of 60 plus years, sometimes memories are distorted. I first met Jim at Dolph Shay's basketball camp in the summer of 1961. When I attended. It was before our senior year in college. And I have a recollection, however dim it may be, of meeting him at Dolph Shay's. Now, if he were to say, no, Rex, I wasn't there, you're fabricating this, I wouldn't be surprised. I'm pushing 80. But I do have a recollection of meeting him there. When we came on campus in September of 62, and we had our first meeting in a conference room at Manley Fieldhouse, that was when the team first came together, received the opening words of the coach. We even received a poem that he gave us on the unfillable hole. And I found that poem still online, where you can put your hand in a bucket of water and you can stir around and make quite a maelstrom. But when you remove your hand, the water stills and the quiet remains. And his message to us as a group of pretty highly recruited people was basically that you can make a lot of noise, but to remind us to be humble. But Jim was at that meeting along with Dave and the rest of us, and really didn't, pleasant guy. Hadn't met him except for that brief interval at the summer camp. And so it was great meeting our fellow teammates. I really didn't know any of them except for Dick Abelman, my high school teammate. And it was pretty exciting for me, speaking for myself, and I suspect for the other people, to begin our college basketball career that way.
So, Jim comes in as a walk-on, and I've talked to some of your other teammates, and, they'll make the jokes. We've all heard it before. Oh, he's got the glasses, he's skinny. Even Jim tells the story this way. But we all know he had a little bit of game once he got on the court. Do you remember seeing him play for the first time, maybe even like in a pickup game or a practice before your freshman season starts?
Yes, yeah. Before the official season began, when we would have the first official practice, we were pretty much expected to go over to Archbald Gym and to participate in the pickup games. My recollection is that sometimes the coaches were in the far distance looking on and to see what was going on, but they weren't allowed to have direct contact and be coaching up the players.
Right.
But yeah, we would have regular pickup games, and it was pretty clear. Now, speaking as one who was probably taller than I was talented, shall we say, and I say that in respect to the raw athleticism that you often see today. Jim and I were probably somewhat similar in that respect, at least with respect to our fortunes weren't going to be made based upon our raw athletic ability. But from the very beginning, one of the things about Jim was he was the guy who was in the right place at the right time. He knew and understood the game. His feet, while they may not have been the fleetest feet on the court, always seemed to be in the right place, and he had that gift of great anticipation, and was just one of those players who knew and understood the game. So, and if you were open, Jim would find you.
Did you see qualities in him back then that made you think that he would someday be successful as a basketball coach?
Oh, yeah, yes and no. Yeah, yes and
Okay.
no, in the sense that it was very clear, and looking back at the years that we spent together as teammates, Jim was a real basketball mind. He knew and understood the game. I honestly never considered myself to be the student of the game, but Jim was. And I would say even from our earliest, the times that we would play together, uh, he demonstrated those qualities. Now, would we have expected, would that have translated to a guy who led an elite program for 47 years? Probably not. That was truly remarkable and over the top. But it really didn't surprise me, although my recollection was that he went on, got his master's degree, I think in history, was looking at a career as a teacher, if I recall correctly. And so perhaps maybe he even surprised himself with respect to the flight that his career took.
I would imagine he did. I mean, nobody has that much ego to think that they would, right? When you're 22 years old and you're in college, do you really think you're going to coach somewhere for 47 years and win over 1,000 games? I don't think, no.
I don't think so.
So you played with him under Fred Lewis, your all's coach at the time, the man that recruited all of you. Did you see any of the things that Fred Lewis taught or used that Jim then incorporated in as a head coach?
Well, we played a little bit of zone defense, so the vaunted 2-3 zone may be part of Fred Lewis's legacy. But it's, I think what some of us old guys see now in the evolution, perhaps devolution of the game, is that the athletes today are so good and so athletic, and that sometimes they rely on that raw athleticism rather than basketball 101, the skills that we look to. We were, except for Dave, who was an air maven before it became popular. Most of us were not renowned for our leaping ability, so we actually had to box out when the ball went up, and Fred coached us. One of the things Fred did, and I don't know whether Jim has incorporated this, but every year as practice began, we would go back to basketball 101 and basically would relearn the basics that kids are taught or are supposed to be taught when they're 8 years old. How to throw a correct chest pass, popping the back of the hands together to get the pop on the ball. how to set a screen, how to roll to the basket with the defender on your hip, and all of this basic, and it would be teaching slow to fast, simple to complex in terms of the instructions. Now, I don't know if they still do that, but Fred was certainly meticulous. Jim was there, so I would guess that he would incorporate some of those techniques and styles in his subsequent coaching.
Now, I've heard and read in some of the biographies about Jim that he was quite accomplished at everything from ping pong to pool to cards. I was wondering if you had any experiences with him in those areas.
I can't say that I did, but Jim was very, very, very competitive, and I saw him get into it. And Jim, again, was not the biggest guy in the world in terms of raw size. I think he was about 6'4", maybe 6'5", maybe about 165 pounds. Not an overwhelming physical appearance, but Jim didn't back away. And I can remember a game where we played Pitt, and they had a guy who had been a high school All-American football player by the name of Brian Generalovich. And Brian came down the court. The only thing between him and the basket was Jim Boeheim on the free throw line. He might have gone around Jim either way, but instead he decided to go over him, and Jim took the charge and was knocked into about the third row where the football players at Manley Fieldhouse used to sit under the baskets. And I think he got knocked into about the third row, but he didn't back down. He took the charge. I saw him in a few times. One time after we had graduated, we were playing in a tournament. In our senior year, after the season was over, we were playing in a tournament, I think in Binghamton. And I can remember Jim getting into it with somebody on the court because he was competitive. He was a fiery competitor, and he wasn't about to back down. I never saw him throw hands, so I don't know how he would have done, but he wasn't the guy who was going to back down from a conflict.
Well, he went on and he played in the Eastern League, which was a rough and tumble league. So you'd have to be able to either stick up for yourself or know when to get out of the way.
Absolutely. And I think Richie Cornwall played for that same team, if I'm not mistaken. Wilkes-Barre Scranton, I think it was. And yeah, the Eastern League was, they were rough and tumble.
Yeah, the Scranton Miners back in the day. You know, I've always been intrigued in the racial dynamic of your recruiting class, that first class that Fred Lewis brings in. Because when you consider it's the early 60s, and it was just a few years earlier, 1957, when Syracuse had a lineup where they wouldn't put 3 black players in the starting lineup. And then here you are 5 years later, Fred Lewis comes in, and in his very first recruiting class, he recruits 2 very high-profile black players in Sam Penseal and Dave Bing. And then I just marvel at what Fred did then. He didn't have the black players room together. He split them up. He had Dave and Sam rooming with white players. And I was just wondering what impact you think that had on yourself, the team, and also Jim.
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question. That's a very good observation. As a matter of fact, Sam Penseal was my roommate my freshman year. And Sam and I, when we showed up on campus, we were both 17 years old. I was probably 17 going on 12 in terms of my maturity and having grown up in a lily white community in the town of Bethlehem, just outside of Albany. Yeah. And Sam was probably 17 going on 46, having grown up in a much bigger world than I grew up in. He grew up in Harlem. So I think it was, I don't know who was more shocked and challenged by the experience of rooming with someone, whether it was Sam with this young, naive kid, or whether it was me with this guy that I would listen to the stories and it was like, really? But Sam and I are very dear friends to this day, and very close friends, talk pretty regularly. And one of the interesting things is that we've never talked about race. We never then in the day talked about race. It was just we roomed with whom we roomed with. And I guess whatever happened, happened. But in retrospect, it was certainly very positive. But when I worked, my real career was with the National Education Association, 31 years in labor relations. Mm-hmm. And in the course of that, I was involved in a number of sessions of diversity training. And in the course of that, with mixed racial groups, I heard stories of the experiences of African Americans that I had never heard before. It certainly wasn't part of my world. And I was honestly shocked and stunned to hear some of those stories about what a day in their life was like. And I subsequently had conversations in more recent years with both Sam and Dave and saying, did this happen to you? Profiling some of these experiences. And I think Sam just laughed at me, said, of course it did, and told a couple of stories. And it was shocking to me because I grew up in kind of a cloistered, again, lily white, for lack of a better term, community. So it was just not part of my experience. But Fred, did bring the roommates together. The year of our senior year, the team that started 5 African Americans won the NCAA championship that year. So that was a huge breakthrough, and that kind of opened the doors to the world that we see today, where even coaches that had been at schools that would never recruit a Black player, I think finally had an epiphany and said, we better start recruiting the best athletes regardless of color, or we're going to get left behind.
It's interesting. You're referring to the 1966 Texas Western team with Don Haskins as their head coach. It's now Texas El Paso, UTEP. You guys were 1 game away from being in that same Final Four.
We were.
For a school that had very little basketball success, this recruiting class that came together, Fred Lewis's first class, but your senior year, you make it to the Eastern Region Finals and lost a heartbreaker to Duke.
We did.
In Raleigh, North Carolina, by the way. Duke had a very long trip.
Interestingly enough, we were averaging 100 points a game until that game when we scored in the 80s, and we ended up averaging for the season 99.9 points a game. Before the 3-point shot or the shot clock. So we had a pretty running team that year.
I can't believe you guys were able to average that many points a game with no shot clock and no 3-point shot. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it was really remarkable. And we also had a pressing defense from just about beginning to end, forcing a whole lot of turnovers. So we were definitely a transition team. And I will say, and again, I don't know how, I don't see too many teams. I don't see really any teams showing the discipline in a fast break that we would practice hour after hour after hour, where the outlet pass following a rebound went to a certain spot on the court. That took the ball into the middle. 2 lanes filled on the outside, and then the ball in the middle would stop at the free throw line unless they had a clear lane to the basket, because the free throw line was a yield sign. It wasn't a stop sign. But the lanes would fill. So it was a totally disciplined fast break that we would practice hour after hour. And I don't really see that sort of a thing. Even teams that fast break, I don't see that sort of a disciplined approach with anybody these days. So,
did you ever get a chance to go to Jim's hometown of Lyons, New York?
I did not. I heard some funny stories about that when I think Dave and I think Frank Nicoletti might have gone. I think our freshman year home for Thanksgiving dinner at Jim's house, and Jim's house. They shared the house with a funeral parlor. His dad was a funeral director, and in the house it was a funeral parlor. And the other thing was that they also had a pretty big dog, I think a German Shepherd. We heard stories when they came back that the German Shepherd, apparently a friendly dog to some people, but not everyone loves dogs, would put his head on the lap during dinner and there was as they say, there was a stiff in the next room. I think I especially heard from Dave that he was not enamored of being in there with a body in the in the next room. But that was just part of Jim's growing up. That was the world he lived in.
Absolutely. A few weeks ago, many of you guys from that, 1964 to 66 era, even beyond George, guys like George Hicker were there too. You came back together to Syracuse because Dave Bing was being inducted into the Ring of Honor. What was that weekend like to be back amongst all the guys, and especially Jim?
It was a very special weekend for all of us. Chuck Richards came up from North Carolina. Frank Nicoletti came up from, I think he's in New York City now, a lawyer in New York City. And George came in from California. Dave, of course, was there with family. Sam Penseal came in. And it was really a wonderful opportunity for us to get together. I don't think I appreciated it at the time, 60 years ago when we were playing, that there is a Syracuse University basketball family. I've certainly come to believe that in more recent years, that really transcends the generations. I'm very good friends with Sonny Spira, for example, and other guys from different generations. It was really wonderful to get back in. As we are pushing 80, some of us are over 80. I'll be there next September. Chuck, as well as several years older, he was a transfer in from Army. Dave turned 80. Jim will be 80 next November. Some of us are not playing over the rim these days. So we never know what tomorrow's going to bring. And we've had the experience of empty chairs around the table. Carl Vernick, who was a member of the team when we first got there, passed away, I think, in January. Richie Duffy last spring, and a number of other empty seats at the table. So we never know what tomorrow will bring. And the sense, I think, not perhaps only speaking for myself, but having talked with some of the other guys, was that this was really special for us to come back together because it could be in some ways the last hurrah, not only because somebody's going to pass away, but because travel becomes a whole lot more of a challenge as we reach that point, and especially air travel is such an unsavory experience these days that people are not really eager to do it as it becomes more of a challenge. So yeah, it was really special for us to come together and reach back 60 years to some pretty great memories for us.
When you mentioned this Syracuse basketball family, and it's funny, I see it with all you guys, you and Nicoletti and Penseal and Dave Bing, and you guys are all still close. But I see it, the guys that were there in the early 80s, Gene Waldron, Sonny Spera, all those guys, Tony Bruin, they're still close. You go later 80s, early 90s, and Derek Coleman, Stevie Thompson, Billy Owens, Herman Hareed, they're still up there, and we see them all the time, and then all through the years. And I'm wondering how big of a role in all this Syracuse family staying together is due to Jim Boeheim being here throughout it all, and especially 47 years as the head coach.
Well, he's certainly been a constant. He was certainly a constant for all of us, for the different generations. I don't know whether it was through his influence or just the fact that we shared a common bond and common experiences, with Sonny and some of the other players that I've been close to. One time we came back for a Syracuse alumni basketball weekend. Would always bring my grandsons. Back in the early days when I was still playing in the alumni games, I would bring my nephew, who ended up playing at Bucknell, ended up playing in Europe, ended up playing for the Washington Generals, losing games all over the world. But I would bring my family back, and my sons and then my grandsons back. And a few years ago, I was talking, I think, in the strength and conditioning room, because I have a background in strength and conditioning, and chatting with them. and looked out, and my grandson, Scott Trobridge, was out on the court with one of the other guys, and he was coaching him up on the finer points. Scott played. He was actually supposed to play in college, and he ended up doing ROTC instead. But it was just a great example of, I brought my kids up, and some of the other players were looking out for them and taking care of them and coaching them up. So it was really a great experience.
Last question for you, Rex, before we let you go. What do you think Jim Boeheim's legacy is? Because it's a big one, right?
It is a very big one. It is a very big one. And, I am one who uses social media perhaps more than I should. And during the last couple of years, when the team was struggling a bit and Jim was drawing quite a bit of fire from various people, I will probably become unpopular for saying this, but I always wondered, with the harshest critics, how many of them had ever played basketball, especially at a high level. They seem to have all of the answers to the problems, but I was not really persuaded of their credentials to do that. But I think sometimes the immediacy of news and things is changed by the perspective of history, which has a little bit more of a dispassionate view. And I think the history of collegiate basketball will look back on Jim and say this was really a remarkable guy who had a remarkable record over many, many years. So I think he will be viewed very well. His legacy is assured, I believe.
Excellent, Rex. Listen, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure. It's always good chatting with you, and I'm glad we could finally get you on the podcast, especially for this special occasion, what's going to be a special week leading all the way up to this Saturday, February 24th at the JMA Wireless Dome. So thank you for joining us here on the podcast. And for those out there listening in, we'll see you next time.
Join us next time for the Inside Syracuse Basketball podcast presented by Crouse Health, the exclusive healthcare partner for Syracuse Athletics.